host, writer, and editor Jane VanVooren Rogers, and I am so excited to be here today with author Jamie Brenner to talk about her novel Blush that just came out in June. So Jamie, welcome. First of all, so excited to have you here.
Very excited to be here, Jane. Looking forward to talking, lots to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jamie is the author of 5 novels, and she grew up in suburban Philadelphia on a steady diet of Jackie Collins and Judith Krantz novels. And she actually dedicates the book Blush to those 2 authors. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, Jamie? Like how did that come about, and why did you dedicate the book to those 2 authors?
Sure. Well, in many ways, Blush is a book I've always wanted to write. It just took me some time to figure out sort of how to tell this story. But it was the books by Jackie Collins, like Chances and Scruples by Judith Krantz, that I was reading when I was growing up. And these were the stories that made me want to become an author, but also the stories that told me like maybe I could do whatever I want in life, versus the counter messaging I was getting at home and at school, which was, be nice and pretty and think about getting married or maybe be a teacher, but like, don't think too big. I remember telling my 4th grade teacher that I wanted to be a writer, and she said to me, well, maybe you can be a teacher. So
Wow.
that was sort of like, okay. And then I would read these books that I was not supposed to be reading, that I literally would sneak out of the library, and I would check out a copy of Chances or The World is Full of Married Men. And then I would also check out like an age appropriate book like Beverly Cleary or Nancy Drew. And when I got home, I would swap out the book covers so that when my mother came in, she couldn't see what I was actually reading. And I was definitely too young to be reading these books. They're completely salacious. But they did have one important message, which is girls can do anything. And it was clearly a very deliberate thread throughout all of these books. The writer Ann Tyler said, I read to live more than one life in more than one place. And I really feel I was reading to have more than one mother, more than one best friend. I was really seeking a counter narrative to what I was seeing and experiencing in my very limited suburban life. So Jackie Collins and Judith Krantz were just completely instrumental in me thinking about what my future could be.
How interesting. And I love that spirit of exploration too, that you took on in wanting to seek a life beyond what you were told was possible for you. I think that's a great message for women especially.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, in the 70s, it was very different growing up as a girl in the 70s and 80s versus looking at the world my daughters are in today. So a young woman today might say, well, of course, you can do whatever you want. And that's why I had the idea of different generations of women coming to these same books and the different perspectives they bring to the stories. So in Blush, which is the story of 3 generations of women who converge at the family winery at the start of the summer, and they find that they are on the verge of losing the winery. There's the grandmother who's been an integral part of the vineyard from the beginning, the daughter who's in her 50s who went off to have her own family and her own life, and the granddaughter who's in her 20s in college. And they all are there in this time of crisis. At the same time, they rediscover the books that the grandmother had once read in her book club during the 80s. These same books that I'm talking about, Jackie Collins, Judith Krantz, Shirley Conran, and they form this sort of makeshift book club. And through these stories of the past, they kind of get clues how to correct the ship of their own lives.
Well, and that's, such a fascinating concept. And I love that. As soon as I first heard about you and about Blush, I thought, what a cool idea for a book that it's embracing, these novels of the past and and having women find solutions in their own lives based on, the characters from past books that, again, may have been written off as, trashy women's romance novels, which again, women's, writing sometimes tends to be put down, in that way, and especially in that genre sometimes.
Absolutely. In fact, I felt that was the case, but it became even more clear to me when I watched the documentary about Jackie Collins that just came out a few weeks ago called Lady Boss. And it had clips of her, going on these talk shows to promote her books, and just the condescension from the male talk show hosts, and even sort of the aggressive pushback by some of the women in the audience who said, your book is trash and I threw it out. I don't even want to have it in my house. Like the message she was putting out was so threatening to people. Like they had to sort of dismiss it rather than give it any kind of credibility, because it was too much to say, oh yes, women can be passionate, sexual, ambitious creatures and not be a villain.
Right.
So I think we do take for granted sort of the different ways we see women depicted in film and TV, with all their agency in life. And it just wasn't always that way. And Jackie Collins and Judith Krantz were really pioneers. However, I think they were really speaking to young women, like in your 20s, like be all that you can be. And what I wanted to do with Blush was take that message and sort of bring it a step further for today, which is to remind women in their 50s or older that you can still do what you want. It's never too late. We have second acts, we have third acts that can be just as important and just as powerful as the first. So I feel like that while we've made inroads culturally telling young women they can have whatever career they want, we still have a ways to go when it comes to how we think of and present to women in midlife or older age.
Absolutely. Helping to support them in, a different stage of life that may have more independence than those younger ages in which they may have been more caught up with, marriage and family obligations and raising children and things like that, that obviously are very time consuming, and that women sometimes do, take a pause, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, to sort of do that, that caretaking and family raising and things like that. And so yeah, I think that's a wonderful message for, for older women as well. It's not too late for them to, go after their dreams and go after the things that are important to them. And I know I've been racing through your book this week, and my kids have been asking me, like, oh, Mom, so, wow, you're really whipping through this book. It must be really good. And I said, yeah, it is really good. But I know one thing that really, jumped out at me was kind of the sort of the inherent, sexism that you describe as part of, kind of the winery culture, or that was part of the winery culture, and how essentially these three generations of women, perhaps in different ways, have been sort of left out of this family business for the most part. So can you talk just a little bit about that with the characters and kind of how that relates to each of them?
Sure. So yes, the idea of the wine business being male dominated works really well for this story, but it's actually completely true. I read a memoir called The Vineyard by a woman named Louisa Thomas Hargrave, and she and her husband were pioneers. They started the first North Fork vineyard back in 1971, and they were partners, of course, but she was not allowed to be a part of the paperwork because only the, quote, head of household could sign the documents they needed to start their business. And, going even further back in history, there was a time when women were not allowed to be around the juice fermenting in the barrels because it was believed they could turn the wine. So there's just a long sort of irrational history of wine being a man's world. And this is an important part of the book because it's sort of symbolic for a lot of things. Like, what is the division of labor in a marriage, and what is the role of like a son versus a daughter in a household? How is a family legacy allocated or not allocated? And these are all things that the women in my book grapple with. The grandmother, Vivian, goes out to the North Fork of Long Island as a very young woman, believing in her husband, wanting to be a partner. And I think he intended for her to be a partner, but slowly she found herself sort of pushed aside, and she assumed the more traditional roles of wife, hostess, homemaker, mother, which is fine, except when a crisis hits, she is not involved enough to sort of have a say or help course correct. She realizes she's given up too much power, with the best of intentions. And now here she is later in life feeling helpless. Her daughter, Leah, always wanted to be a partner in the business, but her father pushed her aside and said, no, this is for your brother. This is a man's world. You go off and do, live your own life. So she's cast out. And she does become a businesswoman in her own right, but her father still doesn't take her seriously. And when she returns to the winery and finds that it's about to be lost, she realizes that if she doesn't act now, she's never going to have a chance to reclaim what she's wanted her entire life. And then there's her daughter, Sadie, who's in college, and she is like very much life of the mind, feminist, reading Susan Sontag and Julia Kristeva. And her power and her feminist identity is purely academic. She's never really had to confront that in action in the real world. But when she gets to the Vineyard this summer and she sees what her mother and grandmother are going through, she is forced to think about what it means to be a feminist, to be proactive, to have agency in the real world, not just in a book or in writing.
Well, and I love, some of the passages where you're writing about, Sadie and the youngest granddaughter character, and how she knows that really she should be working on her thesis. But she's really drawn to, this hidden, journal that she's found of her grandmother's, and drawn to, the Shirley Conran novel as well. And again, it's almost this kind of like, guilty pleasure / a little bit of procrastination. And I definitely personally related to that of all those times when it's like, I know I should be writing some, I should be writing my book. I should be writing some, academic thing that I need to write, or finishing an assignment or something like that. But then when you get, pulled into something else, and it's kind of the impact of that. So.
Yeah. I mean, here she is, she's trying to be a serious writer. She's behind in her thesis, and she picks up one of these old books, and she's like, how could my grandmother have like read this trash? Meanwhile, she can't put it down. Like, she's turning the pages, she's fully involved. And I'm trying to show that like good storytelling is good storytelling. Like, it doesn't matter what the cover looks like. It doesn't matter how it's classified. But if a book is speaking to you, that's powerful. And what's to say what book is a classic? What's to say what book is feminist? However you experience the book, that's what that book is to you. And, we talk a lot about guilty pleasure or, beach reading. And it's like, I don't know why we have the need to sort of excuse our choices. Like, we shouldn't have to categorize it. Harold Robbins was writing these really trashy, salacious books at the same time, but he didn't get half the criticism that Jackie Collins and Judith Krantz did. He was just a commercial fiction writer, very successful. No one felt the need to put some kind of label on his books, like, oh, this is a shopping and sex novel. So, and I even found in my own life, I worked in book publishing. I had very literary circle of friends, and I didn't always jump up and down and say, well, actually, these are my favorite books. I always had an answer if someone said, what what books was your favorite? And I would pull something from college, right? And then one night I was at this party, and it was a literary fundraiser, like all these great writers and agents were there, and somehow the topic of these books came up, and everyone chimed in with their own memories of reading and loving these books. And I realized that these books transcended, any kind of barrier. Like, it doesn't matter how intellectual, gender, anything, everyone was reading these books. So this was 40 years ago, and now the books that were on the bestseller list, they've endured in our mind. And to me, I make the case in the book, these are classics.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think that I think you had cited somewhere another example of being at a function. I think it was maybe at Princeton, where you could tell that you were talking about your writing and that you were kind of losing, someone, that as soon as you started talking more about your subject matter, that they were like tuning out. So do you have any kind of suggestions, I think, for writers and authors who are, again, embracing, different genres and different concepts, and again, whether it's considered, more popular fiction or romance or
Right.
whatever, how do you kind of stand up for that, I guess, in those cases, and not feel marginalized or insulted? Do you have any kind of suggestions on that?
I think it's really important to have your own definition of what success is. I think as women, we sort of tend to be people pleasers, and we want approval. And we learn the hard way that you can't please everyone. And that absolutely applies to writing books. So if you're writing romance, it doesn't matter what the New York Times thinks of you. It matters to what the women who are going to the library or the bookstore think of you. Like, know your audience, and that is your only bar for, how you should be measuring your success. And of course, there's always some subgroup of books that breaks through, whether it's Julia Quinn now because her historicals were made into Bridgerton. So now suddenly it's like, okay to be like, oh yeah, I read Bridgerton. Meanwhile, 2 years ago, nobody would say that. And the New York Times would not be writing about it. So it's just, you can't look for these, it's sort of like, you can't look for these external markers of approval. You have to know what you're doing and for whom you're doing it, and be okay with that.
Those are great tips. Thank you so much for that. I think, like you said, defining your own idea of success, up front, and in reading more about, self-publishing and book publishing and things like that lately, that it's almost like you have to decide what those goals are up front. Is it sales? Is it getting your name in print? Is it,
Right.
And then it's like, then you'll know eventually if you met the goal or not, based on what goal you set for yourself.
Right. And whatever that goal is, it's fine. Like if it is, being, reviewed in the New York Times, that's totally fine. Just understand that your goal, like if what you're writing is a reasonable attempt to get there, or if that's not something you should even be worrying about, because it's, that would be a complete just bonus, but not integral to you achieving, the artistic integrity of your project.
Yeah. So what would you say, were or are your goals as an author? And when you started out doing this, what sort of goals do you have set for yourself and for Blush? What were you and are you really hoping to accomplish with that?
It's a really good question. I always feel like, books, like, it sounds extreme to say this, but I say like, oh, books saved my life, because in any difficult time, like, that is what I turn to. Like, I'm introverted. I tend to turn inward. I'll read a book. Other people might work out, or they might want to go out with friends. Like, to me, the book is always the greatest place of comfort and solace, or figuring things out. So I write books to be escapist and positive, and offer the happy ending that we don't always get in life. Like fiction, in life, we don't get things wrapped up neatly at the end. And I always want to hope that that is possible. So those are the types of stories I tell. And I do get emails from women saying, I read this while I was going through X and it really got me through. Someone who was interviewing me recently told me that she read the book. She had a terrible reaction to her COVID vaccination and she was up all night. She had this like crazy insomnia. And so what did she do? She read Blush all night. Like that's what my books are for. I want to be that friend in the middle of the night. And it feels really good when people anecdotally tell me that's how they experience them, because that's how I experience my favorite books.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm not happy for her COVID shot reaction, but it's always, I'm sure it's so fantastic as an author, though, to hear that someone stayed up all night reading your book and that it was that engaging and interesting and fun for them. And like I said, I know I've been doing a lot of that this week too and I'm not a fast reader, but I was, I felt like I was doing like a page a minute, it's like, oh, wow, I've read, 40 pages in 40 minutes. Like, this is not even like me, but this is great when you find something that's that absorbing and the characters are so rich. And I think too, sort of being in between the ages of Leah and Sadie, where it's kind of like I'm not quite to the Leah stage yet. I'm definitely not at the Sadie stage anymore. But seeing, as you were talking about with the different generations of women, and seeing my grandmother and my mother represented in that as well, and just understanding the way that my grandmothers would have interacted with my grandfathers and the way that they would have kind of deferred to them on, business and financial decisions, I think especially. And then seeing how, Leah has been essentially, like you said, kind of shoved out. I mean, not even kind of, she's been shoved out of this business in favor of her brother, Asher, who really doesn't have a whole lot to offer. He's really not giving anything to the family or to the business, and just seeing the frustration of that and seeing how that's gender based in that situation. I
mean, I think some people communicate to me and they say, oh, Leonard's a jerk, or why would Vivian accept that. But it's like, you have to put things in the context of their time. Like you can't take our sensibility and apply it to people who grew up in a completely different era. Decisions, actions, attitudes, they're all shaped by the world around you. So to me, yes, I can look at my grandmother and, a wonderful, smart woman, but did she live her life to the fullest? No. But no one told her to do things any differently, or if she thought of doing something differently, it would seem strange. And it makes me kind of sad. So, and again, I also think it's never too late to correct. If you held back, if you turned down opportunity, if you didn't try something, that's fine. Like we've all wasted time, or we've all acted out of fear or not acted out of fear. But that doesn't mean we can't turn around tomorrow and do something completely different. And, I really hope that people take that to heart, because I believe it. Like I've tried to live that way. I didn't write my first book until I was in my 40s, even though I'd always wanted to. Why did it take so long? Oh, because it seemed indulgent and I had to work and I had kids and, which is
so
fine.
Relate to that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for saying that as a woman in my 40s who has yet to, publish my first book beyond a poetry chapbook, and getting kind of sidetracked by life and family and all those things, trying to do paid work. And so how were you able then to sort of overcome those concerns and push forward?
It was not easy, but the fear of realizing I really might never do this if I don't start now overrode my discomfort with some sacrifices, like the financial security or, time I had to say no to family stuff. Like I just had to say, for for the first time putting myself first,
Mm.
just for a bit, and let's see what happens. And it's also encouraging that, you know, in the field we're in, you don't have to start in your 20s. Judith Krantz was 50 when she published Scruples, her first book. I mean, we're really lucky to be in an industry. We don't have to be young. We don't have to be any of the things that, you know, women often feel like, if I don't strike now, I no longer have any value.
Right.
So, I mean, we're really lucky, you know, wanting to write. And that's something you can do for your whole life. It doesn't matter. You start at 50, you can have a 30-year career if you're lucky.
Right. When I always love those lists that you see of those kind of later in life success stories for people who are actors and writers and things like that, that it's always refreshing and surprising to me when you see those kinds of things. And again, just understanding that, you know, hey, it's okay if you haven't found your thing yet, or if you've found your thing, but you haven't quite been able to enact that in your life. And so it seems like that really applies to, you know, the characters, the three female characters in your book as well, too, that, like you said, they then are able to allow this family, business crisis to, you know, help them to push forward and really begin to, you know, see how they've been left out of things, and to try to start correcting that. And like you said, course correcting to create the lives that they want.
Yeah, because I think it's tempting. And, you know, these characters, Vivian, the grandmother, you know, she turned the other way and just said, oh, that's the way it is. I'll just focus on something else. And Leah accepted, you know, her father's refusal to take her seriously. And then you get to a point in life where you realize all the chickens are kind of coming home to roost, whatever that saying is. And you can't pretend that somewhere down the line you'll fix it, because the down the line is today. And it's like, you're going to do it or you're not going to do it. And that's like the moment that these women find themselves in, which is a fascinating moment to explore. You know, it's a moment of high pressure, but of high possibility. And that's the state that Blush takes place in.
And can we talk just for a minute about the irony of Leah's business and what that is? Because I found that to be such a fun and interesting, you know, element of your book. So can you tell us a little about Leah's business?
Sure. So Leah owns a cheese shop, which sounds like a very simple thing, but cheese is actually as complex as wine, which is something I learned while I was doing research. I took a wine and cheese pairing class at a place called Murray's in downtown New York. And both wine and cheese have this concept of terroir, which is essentially like of a place or taste of a place. And this really, to me, played into the characters as well. If you have wine growing in the North Fork of Long Island, you know, it can only be of that soil. Same with cheese, wherever the cows are grazing, that's sort of like the foundation of the cheese. You can have a great version of it, but the flavor profile is defined by the place. And as people, you know, we can grow up and reinvent ourselves and have different careers and do whatever we want. But the one thing we can never change is our terroir, our place of origin. You can never change where you're from.
Right.
So like all of these things kind of played into each other. So Leah was cast out of the wine business. So what does she do? She does sort of something similar, something perhaps slightly less high risk, something a little more accessible. She has a cheese shop. But the skills and the thinking and the knowledge are really very similar to what she learned growing up being around wine. So, and even still, her father still doesn't even recognize that she's exhibiting the same sort of, the exact skill set he should be valuing for the winery. Instead, he dismisses her as like, oh, you have a little cheese shop. So cheese is
we're not seeing all of those natural connections with the wine and the cheese and how those things could potentially, you know, go together and pair.
Right.
And like you said, like you said, cultivating that exact skill set that would be so helpful, you know, for them in the family business.
And, you know, really like if you eat the right cheese paired with wine, both taste better. And it's, including is always additive. And instead of including his daughter, he wants to separate. But like wine and cheese, if he included her, it would only strengthen what he has going on. But these are lessons that, had to be learned through the torturous drama of this one summer. But it all sort of ties together.
So when you mentioned the research that you did, you mentioned the wine and cheese pairing class, but just reading the book, you can obviously tell that you did probably a lot of research, or that you just really know your stuff about, about feminism and about place and about wine and cheese and things like that. So can you talk to us a little bit about how much research went into this, and what kinds of things did you do, to really be able to write from a place of knowing?
I did a lot of research. Like, I had a very
it shows.
Yeah,
I think it shows.
Wine, I knew close to nothing about wine when I started this book, and it was a huge learning curve. But fortunately, there's a lot of great resources, and wine is something that's like it's of the real world. Like, you can go to a vineyard, you can, see the grape trees and all that. So I did a combination of things. I read a lot of books, like The Vineyard by Louisa Thomas Hargrave. I read a book called Wine and Words by Letty Teague, who's a great wine critic. I read this true life soap opera called House of Mondavi about the Mondavi wine family.
Oh, wow.
And then I was lucky enough to know someone who is the CEO of a winery in the North Fork called Vidal Cellars. And I spent a lot of time there talking to the vineyard manager and walking around the crops and observing people enjoying the wine on the tasting room. And talking to the winemaker, who's this brilliant man named Rich Olson Harbich, and I took one of his classes. So it was a combination of reading and really talking to people who have made their career in this world, which is endlessly fascinating. And I could have gone into even more detail. Like, I had to discipline myself not to overwhelm the fictional story with the real story of winemaking, because that could have been its own book.
Yeah. I can see that, where it could be difficult not to get bogged down in the research and in the finding and the cultivating of all of the information that you don't, go, wait a minute, I got to get back to this actual story that I'm reading. So where did the story start for you, as far as, being inspired and to tell this through the story of a winery? What was the spark there for you?
I was researching a previous novel called Drawing Home, and I was in Sag Harbor, and I was having dinner alone at a restaurant one night, a place called Wolfer Kitchen. And on the wine list was all wines with the same name, Wolfer Vineyard. So I was like, oh, this cool. This must be like a family thing. And they had a bottle of rosé called Summer in a Bottle. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is a book. Like, just the whole thing, like Summer in a Bottle and the family vineyard, North Fork, like that story kind of formulated in my mind. Meanwhile, I had always wanted to find a way to explore the 1980s novels in a book. So while I was thinking of all this, I also had, my daughter was a senior in high school at the time, and she was reading Julia Kristeva's The Power of Horror and Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp. And it struck me that she was reading all this serious stuff in high school, and she'd be horrified to see what I had been reading in high school, which was like all these trashy novels. And I was like, oh my God, wouldn't it be fun if we could read one of those books together and like discuss it from our very different points of view? And the idea of that started me on thinking about Blush. Like, what if? So I took 3 generations of women, I put them on a family vineyard, threw in these novels, and that's how it started.
Very nice.
Yeah.
That's interesting, for sure. And so you mentioned, kind of the 80s nostalgia and things like that. So what role would you say that plays in Blush?
Oh my gosh, 80s. You know, the
Also a
older you
child of
get.
the 80s, so
Yeah.
totally get it. And
That's another thing, like raising kids, like you slip into saying, oh, when I was your age, you know, or like seeing how things are, you can't help but think how different, you know, things like, oh, not having cell phones, or just the way, like, I used to watch Dynasty every week with my mother, and everyone watched it. And the next day in school, we'd talk about it. You know, it was this very communal thing. And you felt like the whole country was watching it, versus today where everything's like very atomized, and this person's watching Game of Thrones and this person's watching this, and, you know, who knows? So, and I do feel nostalgic for that collective experience. Also, like the 80s was such a specific time, like the big jewelry and the makeup and the escada and the shoulder pads, and like it was an aesthetic that made a huge impression on me. And it's something I wanted to revisit in this book because I've revisited it so much in my mind. And it was a fun time. Like, it was an imperfect time, but in many ways, I just feel like it was more fun than the world we're in now. The way we consumed art and TV and books felt a little lighter and, like I said, more collective. And I miss a lot of those things. And the women on TV were these larger than life dames like Joan Collins and Linda Evans and Linda Gray on Dallas. So I just miss that stuff. So this book gave me a chance to revisit it through the memories of Vivian, who was a young mother in that era, and through her daughter and granddaughter who remember it. One remembers it as a girl and the other one never, you know, experienced it. And so is just now getting to get a taste of the formative pop culture of her mother and grandmother.
Well, and I definitely experienced those things too, you know, and I used to watch, you know, daytime soap operas with my mother, you know, Santa Barbara and All My Children.
Yes.
And, you know, and again, just some of the, you know, some of the glamour and the intrigue of those and the romance, you know, of those storylines definitely, you know, stood out. And of course, you know, a host of other soap operas. But then my maternal grandmother also watched like the evening, you know, soaps, like you're talking about, more like the Dynasty and Falcon Crest. And again, there was definitely a different, again, just so much sort of glamour and beauty and fashion and presentation about all of those things that are kind of missing in our current world of, you know, reality shows and other things that, you know, it's more real and it's more authentic. But I think sometimes we almost looked up to those characters more because they were a little bit more, you know, distanced. And
yeah, they were like larger than life. It's like we have life every day. We're living life. But to TV, it used to be something larger than life. And like, again, back to the idea of escapism. And also these books were all made into these fabulous miniseries, which was even better TV, because you would have like a 4 or 5 part miniseries that would go for maybe 4 weeks or something, or maybe sometimes they ran a few nights in a row. I can't remember how they were programmed, but I saw the miniseries lace before I even read the book. And it was just like the experience of watching that was, you know, indescribable. It was completely captivating. And Phoebe Cates, when she like comes down the stairwell and she looks at the 3 women and she doesn't know which one was the woman who gave her away as an infant, and she says, "Which one of you bitches is my mother?" I was like, you know, I mean, you can't compete with that.
Right. Absolutely. So what has been the reaction to Blush so far? What are you hearing from, you know, from your potential, you know, audience and readers, and what are people saying about it?
Well, it's one of 2 things. Either people are like, "Oh my gosh, yes, I remember these books. I love these books. I read these books." Or they're saying, "I'm going to go out and find a copy of one of these books because I haven't read it and now I have to." And I mean, both are equally as gratifying. I love the idea of someone who like just missed these books because maybe they grew up in the 90s and, you know, these had kind of fallen out of favor, going back now and experiencing them. So that's me. If I can induce one person to go back and read Jackie Collins or Judith Krantz, I feel like I've done my job.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds great. Well, and I know that your book is definitely getting a lot of praise and a lot of notice, both from groups and, from individuals too. So how does that feel as an author, as the person who created this whole world and wrote it? How does that feel?
I mean, it's very gratifying, like it's, when you write a book, it's so solitary and you almost feel like no one else is ever going to read it anyway. Like it just becomes, you're telling yourself this story. It's almost hard to believe or to like get your mind around like how many people, like the fact that you're sitting at home, like reading this book and I'm here in my apartment, like doing whatever, like
Right.
it has its own life, like a life of its own. And it's like kind of a mind-boggling thing, but it's really special. And like I said, I am a lifelong reader and I've been on that end of like connecting to a story. So now to be on the other end of like putting the story out there and having other people connect to it is really, really amazing. And it's like very gratifying.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. That's awesome. And I just opened to a page really quick, and I was just going to share just a quick passage. So they're talking about the Lace novel, and it just says, so Sadie, the youngest character, is checking this out, and she, basically we're in her point of view. And also people really liked adjectives back in the 80s, from Lily being described as beautiful, passionate, notoriously temperamental. And it says, each of the four has reason to hate Lily, and each of them is astonished to see the others. For they are old friends who first met in school, old friends who share a guilty secret, old friends whose lives are changed when Lily confronts them and asks, which one of you bitches is my mother? Oh, you have got to be kidding me, Sadie thought. This was what her regal, high-bred grandmother and her friends had been reading? Total trash, probably not worth the paper it was printed on. She wondered if it would fit in her messenger bag. And I just loved that part, because again, it's like on the one hand, she's feeling a bit conflicted about reading this and embracing it, because it's not in her academic, literary kind of, feminist reading that she's doing, but yet she's also so, intrigued by this. So I just thought that was such a fun, fun passage. She wondered if it would fit in her messenger bag.
Thanks. That was I mean, it was fun to write this book. It was also challenging. Like, how do you convey, like, I can't quote an entire book. So a lot of it has to be I can only take a little bit of the book, and then the spirit of the book has to be conveyed through the way the women are reading it. So it took me a while to figure out how I was going to get the point across to people who maybe weren't familiar with these books. What was it like to read these books, and what is the kind of what's the voice, what's the experience, without like just quoting huge blocks of text. And also just I reread the books before I started writing Blush, and some aspects of the books like didn't age that well.
Yeah.
There are things in these books that would not make it past an editorial like sensitivity reader today. Let's put it that way. But again, you have to put these stories in the context in which they were written. And that's something that, Sadie, the character of Sadie, is sort of my portal for talking about this, because she finds things offensive. Like, oh, that sex scene wasn't really consensual. Meanwhile, Vivian never crossed her mind. Like, they didn't think about things like, is this consensual or not? And if you go back and even look at clips of like Dynasty, there's like weird scenes where Blake like throws Linda Evans down on the bed in a way that today you'd be like, call 911.
Right.
But back then she was just like, oh, Blake, So again, context is everything. And it gave me a lot to talk about from that perspective.
So you talk about, some of the things. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that is a really great point, that as Sadie, the youngest generation in the book is encountering these novels, that she's definitely not looking at it through the same lens as Vivian or Leah. And I love that you're making those points, because I think, and I found that in sharing, old 80s movie or 90s movies with my kids too, that I kind of go, oh, wow. Like, so I'm seeing this now differently, showing it to them, even something like, Pretty in Pink, which I've, always, loved that movie, but always was sort of like, Team Ducky, and then kind of looking back at that and kind of going, he's kind of acting like an entitled jerk here, that because they're friends or because he has feelings for her, that he is entitled to a relationship with her romantically. And again, showing that to them kind of made me go, gosh, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm not Team Ducky as much as I thought I was. So those kind of reflections can be really interesting.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Those movies, I mean, a lot of stuff that we took, on a very superficial level, if you dig deep, like 16 Candles, a lot of stuff that happened in that movie.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. And again, this goes back to the 80s is not that far, it's not that distant past. But again, women were portrayed very differently, still objectified, still like the butt of jokes and lacking in power. So when someone reads Blush and says, well, why would Leah accept XYZ? It's like, just go back and watch a movie. Look at the things that we saw that we normalized. And then ask yourself, well, what would a person do in their real life if this was the messaging they're getting, even from just casual entertainment?
Absolutely. Well, and I think, like you said, that goes back to as well, especially with Leah's generation, more of kind of like what you were saying earlier about being geared toward teaching versus being directed more toward your dream of being a writer. That being a teacher was a much more accessible occupation for women, kind of mid-century, 1900s and even before that, obviously too. But as women were really, post World War II, entering the workforce and things like that, and I know Nancy Laird Young and I had spoke about that on an interview a while ago too, of kind of the like nurse, teacher, secretary sort of mindset that women were sometimes, directed to as career options.
And look, being a teacher is an incredibly important job. But the point is, if a boy had said that to her, I want to be a writer, would she have said, maybe you can be a teacher? That's the thing. Like, of course, being a teacher is an amazing job. That is not, you know what I'm saying? But that's not, I wasn't saying
we're not
to
disparaging
her,
teachers.
Right. I didn't say to her, I want to be a teacher. Like, I was saying one thing and she was redirecting me because of how she viewed what was an acceptable goal.
Right.
And so exactly. It's a lot. It's a lot. But that's why books are so important, because it doesn't matter what you're hearing in your household or at school. You can choose your own map. And now, like today, there's so many maps to choose from. Back then, this is another thing. I think I discussed this in the book. Like, when I was growing up, there were like 4 YA authors. Like, you could read Judy Blume, Norma Klein, Paula Danziger, and Beverly Cleary, basically. Now it's just like walls and walls and walls of YA novels. And I have Leah say this to Sadie in the book. She's like, oh, there's so many YA novels. Why are you reading this? Because she insists on reading like Susan Sontag. But we didn't have that many options. So I was reading Jackie Collins books in 8th grade because I didn't have the YA version of that. Today, I think teenagers are lucky they can read like sort of edgy, pushing the envelope YA books. But we didn't have, like, Judy Blume was like pushing the envelope when I was growing up.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I remember that as well. And it was kind of like, hey, did you read, this or that book? And did you see this or that, element in it? And that it may have been something potentially more controversial. And I think I love the way too that you make the connection toward girls and reading and discovery, both kind of, sexual discovery to a certain extent, or information, that sometimes is not, as, or wasn't as readily available to girls. And so can you talk just a little bit about that too?
Sure. I mean, I grew up in a time where, it was still the standard of, if you do X, Y, and Z, then you're ruining your reputation. Like, you have a reputation to uphold. There was never a question of, what do you want? What will make you happy? It was about, like, what would your future husband think of this? Which is mind blowing, that I was literally having these conversations, versus in a book where these women were just like, this is what makes me happy. This is what I want. And I want so much. And I'm not afraid to want and go after that stuff. Whereas there were eras where women and girls were told wanting X, Y, and Z is bad. You're not allowed. You're a bad person. You're a slut. These books said, no, like, I'm a person, I'm a career woman, I have passionate relationships on my own terms. This was very revolutionary. And again, we can take it for granted today. I'm sure a 20-year-old who picks up one of these books will not understand why this was such a big deal, because of all these arguments and because of all the talk shows where Jackie Collins had to defend herself, now women can take that for granted, like all the other little things. And, it's not the Voting Rights Act, it's not the most important thing in the world, but it was important to me. It was important for a happiness, fulfillment level to me to read these things and to have them as reference points and to sort of be part of my formative self. So I think that, there was the messaging, and then these books were the counter messaging, and it was very, very important.
Well, and would you say that, that's still something ongoing today, is that women are still working toward, being accepted for, their self-expression and their ambition, and sort of not being criticized or pigeonholed for those things? Because I think those things are still, unfortunately quite real, where it's almost like if you're too ambitious, then it means, like you said, you're cold, or you're a bitch, or you don't care about your family, or you're like just money hungry, or something along those lines, versus, helping women understand that it's okay to go after what they want.
It's hard to say. I mean, on the one hand, like, I find my daughter's generation, like, I would say to one of them, oh my gosh, you can't wear that skirt out. You can't wear that. And she'd say, Mom, you're slut shaming me. Which is like, what? No, I'm just saying that, then I'm like, wait, what am I saying? So I feel like this generation is like, knows how to advocate for themselves more. But I think there are still statistics that, like, the more money a woman earns, like, counter logically, the harder time it is for her to find a partner, a male partner, if that's what she's looking for.
Right.
Because there's still that sense of, like, that men are threatened by being out-earned. So I don't know, like, what the actual reality is on the ground. I think there's a lot of improvement. And I think certainly the attitude of women today is a lot more assured and true to self and willing to ask and demand and whatever. I can't speak to how men have or haven't evolved, but hopefully, that's a work in progress as well.
Well, and I know you have 2 daughters, is that right?
Yes.
And I'm guessing too that as you were writing this and as you were raising your daughters, that having conversations about these kinds of things and what was possible for them, was a factor in all this too, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at the time that I wrote this, I think I had like an 18-year-old and a 14-year-old, because it was like 2 years ago when I wrote it. So yeah, you're having all these conversations about school and what do you want to do, and boyfriends and girlfriends and this and that. And, you hear yourself talking, and you can both hear things that like you're saying, like maybe your parents said, but you can also feel yourself saying things differently. And so you realize how much you have developed a worldview that you can pass on to the kids, and that's something, again, with the 3 generations of women, I could explore through these characters, the way Leah was raised and what she was hearing from her mother versus the way she raised her daughter and what she's hearing from her daughter. I'm fascinated by that, and I really explored that a lot in Blush. So it did come very much from my own experience, good and bad.
Well, and I think it is interesting sometimes too how younger generations of women can more easily write off some of those older stereotypes or things that aren't as encouraging of women. I have a 10-year-old daughter who's very strong-willed and very independent. And I think sometimes if we're watching, movies or shows and she's seeing things that she doesn't like, or she's seeing the way that a woman is being treated, she can more easily dismiss that, I think, than maybe, women like us who are older and maybe were raised with other other inputs and other expectations. And like you said, all the media and the movies and the books and all the things that kind of shaped, the impressions of women. Whereas my 10-year-old can just kind of step up and go, oh, that's stupid. Like, that's not right. That's dumb. And for her, it's just that simple to just go like, well, that's not even right, or that's stupid. And
great.
I appreciate that about her a lot,
Absolutely.
And so, I guess I hope too that like you say, as younger generations of women step up and read books like Blush and read other books that that they'll help to be able to see too, just that there's a much wider framework for women to build their lives and build themselves.
Absolutely.
So, well, what else would you like to share about Blush or about you? What's next for you?
I am working on a book for next summer, which is set in the jewelry world. It's like a family dynasty, kind of like Tiffany's. And it's a family that became synonymous with engagements and diamond rings, but the women in the family have all been unlucky in love. So it starts out with this granddaughter who's been cast out, coming back to the family to reclaim what's hers. And it's called Gilt, Gilt. Mm-hmm. And there are some similar themes in that women used to wait around to get an engagement ring, and that was like the first important piece of jewelry they would have. Whereas women today are going out and just buying the jewelry they want for themselves. So advertising used to be geared towards men, buy this for your fiance. Whereas now, if you notice, diamond ads are often like, treat yourself, or, you know what I mean? Like, yeah.
The right hand ring and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. So I wanted to explore that a little bit. And that's what I'm going to do in the next book.
Well, that sounds really interesting. And I'm sure that people who read and enjoy Blush, like myself, would definitely be watching out. We'll be watching out for that one for next summer as well. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, also, anyone who's interested in like keeping up, I'm at Jamie Brenner Writes on Instagram, and that's where I kind of talk about books and what's coming next and where I'm going to do events. I'm on that all the time. So that's probably the best way to sort of keep in touch or see what's coming up down the line.
Yeah. Well, and in the meantime, I'm going to pop your book up back on the screen here and just recommend that everybody go get Blush, check it out, read it. It is really fantastic, fabulous, interesting, empowering for women, and also, funny and enjoyable too. So
thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Jamie, just for being here with us. We're so grateful just to learn more about you and your book. And
Jane, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we'll keep the conversation going next summer, right back here.
Absolutely. I'd love to have you back. That would be great.
All right, everyone. Well, happy reading.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Jamie. And
My
thanks
pleasure.
everybody for watching. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.